Jesus Christ! Doesn't anybody here read a damn newspaper?
I do.
Then you know I'm fucking ruined.
There are ladies present, sir.
I don't give a tear, you fucking boob. My investment. The Italian fellow I told you about up in Boston. He was arrested.
Charles Ponzi?
It was a swindle. From start to finish. I was in up to the limit and he took me like some out-of-town Jasper.
Every shell game needs a mark.
Nobody legit can guarantee a return like that, Harry.
I don't have a nickel. I'm dead. I'm sitting here right now, but I'm dead.
You're totally broke.
We'll be okay, doll, won't we? Sure we will. We'll pull through, you'll see.
You fat, worthless fool.
Belle, wait!
Thank you to Factor for sponsoring today's video. Even if you don't know who Ponzi is, you know the scheme that bears his name, the Ponzi scheme, an investment fraud that pays existing investors with funds collected from new investors. Ponzi con artists promise to invest your money and generate high returns with little to no risk. And if we didn't know any better, we'd believe that Charles Ponzi invented this masterfully deceptive plan. But what if I told you that the first Ponzi scheme was carried out by a woman in 1869, 13 years before Charles Ponzi was ever born? But I must say that Spitzeder's scheme doesn't have quite the same ring to it as Ponzi scheme, does it? Her name was Adele Spitzeder, and they never saw her coming. Left, right, and center, she was charming unsuspecting men out of their hard-earned money with her promises of huge returns. But how did a sweet little lady ever get into such a business in the first place? Well, Adele was an actress by trade, and after a 12-year run on the stage, her opportunities started drying up, partly because she wasn't really a good actress, and partly because her good looks were fading. One of her contemporaries flat out called her not very beautiful. Ouch. We'll get into some detailed descriptions of Adele a little later. But there you have it. She lost her career because she didn't have the right look and she didn't have the right stuff. But just because she wasn't fit for the stage doesn't mean that she wasn't a good actress. Because she was a good actress, all right. She acted like she wasn't the biggest thief that Europe had ever seen, and she acted like she was heterosexual to get money from men. Money that she would spend on her girlfriends and on her own very lavish lifestyle. She acted for most of her life, just not so well on stage in shows. But who cares? Because she was getting paid scraps to act in theaters. But William Shakespeare said it best, all the world's a stage. And for Adele, the real money came from acting in real life. This is the story of a Gilded Age grifter who crippled the German economy, all because she wanted more than she could afford, and she refused to act her wage. And she was kind of creepy, too, when it came to her choice of partners, not because she was a lesbian, but because there was an age difference in one of her relationships that was certainly questionable. I know for sure that if she were a man, we would call her out on this. I'll leave it at that until we get there. This is the story of Adele Spitzeder, female con artist and a total hot mess. Let's get into it. But first, if you like these videos about the most scandalous people from yesteryear who make Ty's Hot Mess History a time capsule for the culture, subscribe and hit the notification bell so that you can know every time that I upload content. And please hit that thumbs up to support this video for free. Whether you are watching or listening, thank you for letting me be a part of your day. Now, on to why you are here. February 9th, 1832 started out like any other day in Germany. But the citizens of that nation had no idea that on that day in Berlin, a little baby girl was born who would one day destroy their entire financial system, all because of her sheer greed. Her thievery was reported to have caused a wave of suicides in their nation, because so many people who invested with her lost everything. The baby girl's name was Adele Spitzeder, and here's how it all happened. Like so many children, everything that young Adele wanted to become was heavily influenced by her parents. Her parents were actors and singers. Her father was even a director. Adele's mother was Elizabeth. She was called Betty by those who knew her well. Adele's father was Joseph Spitzeder. Betty was actually his second wife. He had been married before to a woman named Henriette, and he had 6 children with her. But you know how it goes. You get married to stay together forever, and sometimes, after a few months, or 1 or 2 or 6 kiddos, you realize that the two of you just aren't meant to be together. So you move on, and that's what Joseph did. He left Henriette and his 6 children behind to start a new life with Elizabeth. He met her at a theater in Berlin where he was working as a director. He was directing a play in which Elizabeth was an actress. He developed feelings for her and started a workplace romance that eventually turned into his asking Elizabeth for her hand in marriage. She said yes. Then Joseph and Elizabeth got married in 1831. The very next year, in February, Adelheid Louise Spitzeder was born, and apparently those closest to her called her Adele. The theater was in her blood. Her mother, a much sought-after singer and actress, and her father was a critically acclaimed actor and director. As a matter of fact, when Elizabeth was pregnant with Adele, Joseph was performing a run at the National Theater in Munich. His performance was so outstanding that King Ludwig I made a long-term employment offer to Joseph and included Elizabeth in the deal. 6,000 gulden per year if they took a permanent engagement at the National Theater. That's equivalent to roughly $160,000 today in 2024. Permanent work for actors was hard to find in those days. Heck, it still is today. And that kind of money would have made a very comfortable life for their small family of 3. The bottom line was, those types of opportunities didn't come around every day for actors, so it goes without saying that Joseph accepted on behalf of himself, his wife, and his new daughter. The family moved from Berlin to start their new chapter in Munich, but that chapter was a very short one for Joseph, and it was his final chapter. He died just before the year was over on December 13th, 1832, a sudden death at Christmas time. Few things are sadder than that. And it happened before baby Adele even reached her first birthday. Elizabeth was beside herself, as I'm sure you can imagine, living in a strange city and suddenly becoming a widow and single mother all at once. But she did have some help from the king himself. After all, he was the reason that the Spitzeder family was living in Munich in the first place. So he agreed to pay for tuition for all of Joseph's children. Remember, Adele had 6 half-siblings from Joseph's first marriage. A few years after the death of Joseph, Elizabeth married again. Her second husband was a man named Franz Maurer. And by 1840, Elizabeth was acting again. She was hired for a long-term engagement at the Karl Theater in Vienna, Austria. During this time, Adele was put away in a boarding school, a convent run by nuns. After Betty's acting opportunities ran out in Vienna in 1844, she and Adele moved back to Munich. Their living situation was cozy and quaint, to say the least. They went to live with Joseph's first family. And for the first time in her life, Adele was living with her half-siblings as a family unit. She had cousins living there too. Then in 1848, at the age of 16, Adele left her extended family home to further her education. She had the privilege of attending a renowned school where she studied music composition, piano, and foreign languages. Her foreign language studies came in handy much later in her life, during her downfall. We'll get there. But at this point in her life, Adele's star was rising, just not as high as she hoped it would. She did have some talent and some charm, but she just wasn't a natural on the stage like either of her parents. Nevertheless, her acting career started well. Adele studied by shadowing 2 popular Munich actresses, Constance Dahn and Charlotte von Hagen. And to be clear, this was done against her mother's wishes. Elizabeth was dead set against Adele committing her life to the theater. But Adele thought that she had proved her mother wrong when, around the age of 25, She debuted in Coburg in either 1856 or 57, playing the role of Mary, Queen of Scots. She got applause from the audience and good reviews from her peers of the stage. And according to Adele, even the Duke of Coburg himself praised her talent. Now, that part is just something that she put in her memoir and doesn't appear anywhere else that I've seen. And if we're going to learn one thing for sure about Adele in just a moment here, it's that she was a liar. So take that info about the praise from the Duke with a grain of salt. Because if the Duke thought so highly of Adele's talent, he could have used his influence to provide her with steady work, as had been done for Adele's parents before she was born. But it turns out that Adele's debut was the height of her acting career. It honestly went downhill from there. I get the feeling that if Adele had lived in our times, she would be called a nepotism baby. And you know, the way that the public generally looks at Lisa Marie Presley or Kelly Osbourne, like if their fathers weren't Elvis Presley and Ozzy Osbourne, would they really have been able to rise to any level of celebrity? Those are just a couple of nepo babies who came to my mind. In the comments, tell me someone who you think is mainly successful because of who their parents are. That was certainly the case for Adele, and honestly, I think that her mother was just trying to shield Adele from the harsh criticism that she knew was coming Adele's way. But you know how it is sometimes when you're young. You think that you have everything figured out, and your parents are just trying to hold you back, or they don't want you to have any fun. That was the dynamic between Adele and Elizabeth. And I'm not saying that parents always know best, but on this topic, Adele's mother was right. Even with the Duke of Coburg absolutely loving her performances, as she had claimed, there was no more work for her there. So she took a short engagement at Mannheim and then returned to Munich, where she found more work at the National Theater. And yes, this was the same stage where her father was working before his untimely death, where the king himself thought Joseph would work for many years. And there's a big chance that the only reason Adele was able to find work at the National Theater was because of the legacy of her parents. But she wasn't able to secure any starring roles, just a few guest roles, and that wasn't good enough for Adele. She was supposed to be a star. The theater even offered her a contract. They just wanted to make her happy and keep her with steady work. But the work was for supporting roles, and that was just too small for Adele. She had big thoughts and big dreams. Unfortunately for her, she didn't have big talent to match her big ambitions. The competition was fierce in Munich, and Adele was no match for the other young women. So she left Munich, in her mind, knowing that now her mother was against her as well as the entire staff at the National Theater. Just a bunch of stupids, let her tell it. So she took her talents to Bernau, to work at the theater there. Surely this was where she would find her real success and have a long career. Surely the people here had an appreciation for real talent. Surely they would see her star power. Well, they didn't. But just because Adele wasn't having any luck in her career didn't mean that her whole time in Bernau was a bust. She did find luck in love. Gallmeier was the director who hired her, and it almost seems like he hired her out of pity more than anything. Her acting was, okay. But soon he came to regret his decision because Adele was constantly getting into arguments with the other actors. She was jealous of them because they were better actors than she was. That meant that they were getting better roles, more stage time, and more of what Adele loved the most: money. And at this point, Mr. Gallmeier was starting to believe that keeping Adele, a subpar actress, around wasn't worth the trouble. His belief was more than confirmed when Adele really stirred up some trouble amongst her castmates and started a romantic relationship with a fellow actor. Maybe I should clarify and say fellow actress. Her name was Josephine. She went by the stage name Peppy, and she was said to be dazzling. She certainly had captured Adele's attention. Now, today, a lot of people won't bat an eye when they hear anything about a lesbian relationship, especially between two women in the entertainment industry. But this was the 1860s in Europe, and Christianity had a chokehold on the continent. Whether Catholic or Protestant, Christian doctrine declared homosexuality a sin. I don't know what Adele's director, Mr. Gallmeyer's religious practices were, but he was definitely a part of the crowd who didn't agree with Adele's lesbian relationship, but his reasons were more personal. You see, Adele's girlfriend, Josephine, her full name was Josephine Gallmeyer. She was the director's stepdaughter. But Adele didn't care. We already know that as we get deeper into this story, we will see that Adele didn't mind putting her hands on things that didn't belong to her. Well, that applied to more than money. Mr. Gallmeyer gave Adele a firm no on entering into a relationship with his daughter, but unfortunately for him, his daughter didn't share his sentiments. But here's the first time that we observe Adele, quote-unquote, taking something that doesn't belong to her, a girlfriend. And this love affair didn't go as planned for either of the young ladies. Adele got to see another side of Josephine after the newness of the relationship wore off. She found Josephine to be too erratic. The woman who at first excited Adele became a woman who practically frightened her with her unpredictable behavior. And perhaps Josephine walked away from their romance thinking, Father knows best, because she wasn't too pleased with Adele. Josephine thought that Adele was just too boring. And Josephine must have been onto something, because in addition to being a boring lover, Adele's critics found her boring on the stage. As she was written about in Harper's Weekly, quote, young Adele's debuts as an actress were everywhere decidedly unsuccessful. Her favorite role was Leah in Mosenthal's well-known play, and the critics of Germany with one accord advised Mademoiselle Spitzeder to leave the stage for a more congenial field of occupation. She was slow to follow this advice and contented herself for several years filling subordinate positions at second-rate theaters in Germany and Switzerland. End quote. With rave reviews like that, it's probably not surprising to know that when Adele's romance with Josephine ended after 6 months, she went back home to Munich to Elizabeth, her mother. After being home for a little while, Adele got sick. The illness is never mentioned by name in any of the information I read while doing the research for this episode, but whatever it was, it had her down for 6 months, and in that time, her mother was taking care of her. Elizabeth was sad to see that her daughter wasn't feeling her best, but at the same time, she was relieved that Adele wasn't pursuing the stage while she was sick. I guess that if there was a bright side to her being ill or a silver lining, that was it for Adele's mother. She didn't have to listen to Adele going on and on about her pipe dreams of becoming the most famous actress in Europe. Now, they can move on to a new discussion about Adele's new life plans. Woof! Crisis averted. Then, as soon as she got well, Adele was back to talking about returning to the stage and starting up her acting career again. Elizabeth, once again, tried her best to discourage Adele, but it seems like she had never really been good at getting Adele to listen to her. So now, feeling well again after receiving some tender loving care, and totally against her mother's wishes, Adele took off to make it big on the stage once more. Her mother was sad to see her leave, but she wouldn't have to be sad for long, because Adele's bad acting was going to send her right back home. So Adele went off to a few smaller cities in Germany and Switzerland, where, again, she found work, but nothing big. For Adele, if it wasn't a starring role, it was just too small for her. But apparently for everyone who saw her perform, even small roles were too big. She just wasn't that great. Directors are often willing to put up with a bad attitude from an actor if their talent is just outstanding. But Adele had a bad attitude and bad acting skills. She was a liability to every theater she played. So, you already know that it's coming. After a few short months, she found herself on a train back to Munich, jobless and ashamed. And of course, she had to move right back in with her mother. After Adele got all of her belongings settled back into their house, her mother said, and I quote, "I told you so." I might be paraphrasing there. And, big shocker, Adele and her mom went through the same old song and dance during her period of unemployment. Once more, Elizabeth begged Adele to leave the stage, and once more, Adele rebelled and skipped town as soon as she found her next acting gig. Off she went again, this time to Nuremberg, and she was able to work for a whole year. There were still no big roles for her, but she found steady work, and that was a mark of success for Adele. She played a few more cities, including Frankfurt and Zurich, then she went back home. But this time, coming back was different. She wasn't walking through the front door, hanging her head in shame. She was just visiting her mom after having a fortunate streak of success in her career. She was kind of in a position to rub her success in her mother's face, but she didn't. Had she grown up or gained some humility while she was out working that year? It really seemed that way. After all, she took those supporting roles. And during this visit with her mother, Adele was offered another acting job in Pest. Her mother asked her to turn down the job as she always had requested before, and this time, Adele actually followed her mother's wishes and turned down the job, making her mother happy and sparing theater-goers in Pest who would have otherwise had to suffer through her dull performances. Oh, but I guess that I should mention that Elizabeth's plea for Adele to not take that job also came with a payment of 50 gulden per month for life. That's like getting $1,040 per month today. So it didn't exactly mean that Adele could stop working, but she'd have a safe cushion to supplement her income while she worked. Not necessarily life-changing money, but for certain a big help. What would you do with an extra $1,000 a month for the rest of your life? Anyway, it seemed like Adele might have been coming to her senses about leaving the theater behind. But maybe, just maybe, the money made the difference in Adele's decision to grant her mother's request this time around. At any rate, Adele gave Elizabeth her word. No more acting, Mom. I'll stay right here with you. With the steady money coming in from her mother, one thing that we know for sure is that Adele was done with theater. She would never take any more acting jobs. A few months later, she took another acting job. This one was in Altona, which was then a part of Denmark. At this point in her life, Adele's life of criminal behavior has already started because she is essentially stealing from her mother after taking her money in exchange for not acting, then leaving to act. Now, before we get to Altona, where Adele is about to get into some more shenanigans and meet her next girlfriend, I have to tell you another reason why I believe Adele's mother was so adamant about not having her daughter return to the stage. This part of what I'm saying is speculation, I want to make that clear, but only where her mother's motives are concerned. But it's based on what research has shown about how Adele was living her life. In addition to earning a meager salary at acting because she was so terrible at it, Adele would spend all of her earnings, and then some more, on her daily living. She lived way above her means, maintaining this luxurious lifestyle that she simply could not afford. She racked up debt in every city she performed. Just like small roles were not acceptable for Adele, neither were small apartments or small hotel rooms. Oh no. Simple and affordable were words that didn't exist in her vocabulary when it came to her living quarters. And when she traveled from one city to the next, she needed the best seat on the train that money could buy. Then when she got into town to play her bit part for 2 minutes of stage time, she needed to rest in the fanciest hotels and dine on the best food. Only gourmet cuisine would do for Adele. And that's something that you and I can have in common with her. No, not the part about being egotistical thieving over spenders, the eating gourmet food part. We can do that without having creditors trying to chase us down and have us thrown in jail with today's sponsor, Factor. Now, I know that when it comes to YouTube, Ty's Hot Mess History is the only channel you want to watch. You tell me that in the comments all the time. Don't check the comments, trust me on that. But when it comes to your meals, you want options, and Factor offers 35 wholesome meals every week. You'll always have something that suits your lifestyle, whether it's Gourmet Plus, Keto, Calorie Smart, or Vegan and Veggie, which happens to be my option. This fall, do the things you want to do. Keep your plans and let Factor handle the meals. There's no prep and no mess. You'll get to enjoy chef-crafted meals, just like Adele did, except you won't be stealing them like she did. You like saving time in the kitchen, and so do I. When I'm making these long videos, I like to spend my time researching and writing, not working on meal prep for hours at a time. Thanks to Factor, I can pop a delicious meal in the microwave for 2 minutes, then eat it and get back to work for you. I also love the flexibility of it all. I can skip a week when I need to, or adjust my order size. For the foreseeable future, I think that my order size will remain the same, meals for one. But if my wildest dream comes true, and my first celebrity crush wants to dine with me, I can easily increase my order to meals for two, for David Letterman and me. Head to factor75.com or click the link below and use code 50HMH to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. That's code 50HMH at factor75.com to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. The meals are always fresh, never frozen like Adele's cold heart when she stole all that money from all these people in this story. But we'll get there. Thank you, Factor, for sponsoring today's video. Let's get back to Adele. She's in Altona and she's spending a lot of money. But the problem was that she didn't have a lot of money. That meant that when she left a city, her reputation was marked with reviews on her substandard acting, and her unpaid debts were in bookkeepers' records all over Central Europe. And there could have been major consequences for Adele to pay. What would have happened if someone to whom she owed money wanted to physically harm her, or worse? And you know what I mean by that. And let's not forget that debtors' prisons existed in Europe in these times. If she would have had to face legal repercussions for stealing, she could have ended up in prison or a dank workhouse. And I believe that Adele's mom knew what her daughter was up to and just didn't want to see her end up in prison or beaten up by some angry person who was owed a lot of money. Again, that part is just my speculation. Or heck, maybe her mom, who was a really good actress, just didn't want Adele ruining the family name with her second-rate acting all over Europe. Anyway, I think that you can already guess by now that things didn't go so well on stage for Adele in Altona. But off stage, another romance was brewing. Adele wanted to start a relationship with yet another actress, and we know that workplace romances always end well, right? Brenzika was her stage name. Her real name was Emily Steer, and this relationship was the beginning of the end of Adele's uninspiring acting career. Emily shared Adele's determination to make it big on the stage. Unfortunately for Emily, she had another thing in common with Adele, a lack of talent. So these two dames were a perfect fit for each other. They could feed into each other's delusions, one telling the other how great she was, despite critics and theatergoers saying the opposite. Adele and Brenzika started traveling together, taking whatever jobs they could find, one bad performance after another for months on end. Adele became a laughingstock in the theater world. In addition to mocking her performances, now critics were mocking her appearance. Here are some reviews on Adele that will make you wonder why she ever wanted to subject herself to the scrutiny of her peers or anyone else. From Julian Nebel's biography on Adele Spitzeder, he cited one of her contemporaries describing her in this manner, quote, "Not very beautiful, square face with rough traits, out of which a long, broad nose protrudes. The mouth is broad, the chin pointy, the great eyes hard to read. A real butch." End quote. Sir Robert Burnett David Morier, a British diplomat, described Adele as a, quote, "middle-aged spinster, actress of little professional repute, but enjoying extra-professionally a very questionable reputation." End quote. From the Der Neue Pitaval, a collection of criminal stories from the late 1800s, quote, "Due to the independence associated with the profession and the prospect of brilliant success, the acting career held a particular allure for her. She was prepared for her chosen career by several prominent members of the Munich Court Theatre and made her debut at the age of 26. In the following years, she performed on 26 to 29 stages. However, she had little success, which could be attributed to her physical appearance, which was evidently not particularly suited to the stage. The art that denied her laurels also did not provide her with any financial gain. She did not know how to manage her finances, frequently finding herself in financial difficulties, and early on practiced the art of living at the expense of her creditors. In Hamburg and Zurich, where she had engagements, she accumulated significant debts. Her constant financial struggles likely brought her to the decision to leave the stage and return to civilian life. Indeed, in 1868, she ended her artistic career and returned to Munich, where her mother lived." End quote. From Bayerischer Rundfunk News, quote, "She was never really successful. So in May 1866, as an unemployed indebted actress, she returned to Munich to wait for offers from her theater agents. When these did not come, or she turned them down because they seemed too insignificant to her, her theater career was over." End quote. From an article in the Appenzell Calendar, quote, "Adele was to dedicate herself to the stage, although her external appearance should have warned her against this project. In 1860, she appeared as Deborah, but failed thoroughly. Around the same time, she went to Zurich, where she also did not find roses blooming, which led her to leave the city quite soon, not without incurring several thousand francs in debts and leaving her creditors, at least partially, to their fate. Adele later performed in various German cities without the hoped-for laurel wreaths being cast upon her head. Ultimately, she settled in Munich to seek there what the gods had not yet granted her." End quote. And just like that, it was over. Adele had to return to her mom's house because her career was finished. But what wasn't finished was her relationship with Brenzika. She brought her home as if she were a prized souvenir. I'm sure that her mother loved that. Still shilling out 50 gulden per month to her dishonest daughter, and now paying for the living expenses of her girlfriend, too. Needless to say, the two young ladies would have to find another place to live. Even at this point in her life, Adele was still waiting on some big-time acting job that just never came. And she really could have used the work, because she and Brenzika had started a family. No, they didn't have children, but they had dogs to take care of. 6 dogs. So just imagine, Adele never lowered her living standard. She wasn't working. Brenzika was just as horrible at acting as Adele, so she wasn't working either. Both of these broads just thought that they were too good for a quote-unquote regular job. And they had 6 dogs, and they wanted to live the high life. Talk about delusional. Well, the ladies found another exquisite place to live that allowed them to bring their 6 dogs. It was the Munkert Inn. But there was one tiny little problem. Adele didn't have enough money to, pay for their room. The landlord allowed them to stay for as long as he could bear it, living on Adele's promises to pay and catch up the rent. And he might have let Adele and Brenzika go even longer, making partial payments and payment promises if it hadn't been for their 6 dogs. The problem wasn't that the dogs were there. He knew about the dogs when the women moved in, and he was fine with the whole arrangement. His issue was with how Adele and Brenzika were living with the dogs. He didn't like it at all. They were not keeping their quarters clean. And with 6 dogs walking around, doing what dogs do, I think that we can all fill in the blanks regarding the condition of their space. Their apartment must have stunk as bad as Adele's acting. P.U. So they got thrown out and had to find a new place to live. And they did. They got to stay at the Golden Star for a short while before being kicked out of there too, for, you guessed it, non-payment of rent and their filthy living conditions. At this point, you all, still, the only money that Adele had coming in was the money from her mother. She was sending it to her. Adele would have to move around from city to city so that her bad payment history didn't arrive in town before she did. So she left Germany, and along with Brenzika and the dogs, went to the capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Vienna. At this point, a couple couldn't afford to be picky. There was no luxurious apartment for them to mess up this time around. There was a beer bar that had an economically priced inn attached to it, and that's where Adele rented 2 rooms for herself, her lady, and their dogs. Even though this inn didn't meet Adele's high standards, it seemed to be a good situation for her. She made friends with the owners. A big factor in that friendship being able to blossom was the fact that for once, Adele could finally afford to pay her rent. I'm sure that makes a landlord act more kindly towards a person. But this wasn't just a casual, cordial hello and goodbye type of friendship that they developed. The landlords of the inn would sit and have meals with Adele and Brenzika. They even celebrated Adele's name day with her. And that's kind of like a birthday celebration. It's a day of the year that celebrates a person's given name. It seems to have a Christian origin because often the names that are celebrated are biblical names and names of saints. And it just so happens that Adele was named after a saint, the German Saint Adele, who was the daughter of King Dagobert II of Germany. That Adele became a nun after her husband's death, and she established a convent. The irony: Saint Adele was known for her holiness. The Adele in our story was not. And she was far from a nun. But she ended up playing one in real life, and we're almost there. But first, I have to tell you why she had to leave this modest inn, where her living situation with Brenzika was finally stable. Their days of actually paying their rent and living a simple, honest life came to an end one day in October of 1869. A fire broke out in the building, and everyone had to run to escape. As Adele wrote about it in her memoir, quote, "My friend and I, in a state of panic, quickly fled at a high speed. The friend took the money bag with a little over 200 guilders in it. I took the 4 dogs in the arm basket." End quote. I'm not sure when or how their 6 dogs turned into 4. Maybe a couple of them ran away because Adele kept the apartment so dirty. Adele fled the inn in her dressing gown, slippers, and a Queen Elizabeth hat that was part of one of her costumes from her acting days. I can only imagine the look of confusion on the face of the front desk clerk of the next hotel Adele and Brenzika had to check into when he or she saw a woman carrying 4 dogs, wearing a Queen Elizabeth hat, and asking for a room for 2. I am sure that her entrance into the next town didn't go unnoticed. It's 1869, and 2 women are checking into 1 room. That alone is enough to make people stop and stare. Then on top of that, 4 dogs, and the cherry on top of it is the Queen Elizabeth hat. Adele may not have been good at getting attention when she was on stage, but in real life, she was a spectacle. Everyone in town had their eyes on these 2 women and their dogs. They were trying to figure it all out. How strange. What were they up to? It was a tense situation for Adele, and it only got more tense when she started to run low on money once again. This new hotel wasn't as affordably priced as the inn that she had to leave, so the money that her mother was still sending her didn't cover the bills. And we know that for Adele and Brenzika, getting a, job was beneath them. So rather than work, they went in debt, and once again, Adele was back to her old ways, living beyond her means, buying things on credit, and not paying the money she owed. She and Brenzika were going out on the town and living it up. Adele's mannerisms were noted by the town locals, and they considered her to be masculine, always smoking cigars and surrounding herself with beautiful women, not just Brenzika. Her landlords were willing to put up with her behavior that seemed weird, but they were not willing to put up with not being paid for Adele's very expensive room. So, once again, and for the last time, Adele found herself kicked out of another place to live. Nearly out of options, she landed in one of the poorest districts in Munich. She had truly hit rock bottom. But Adele's love for extravagant living wouldn't let her stay down for long. A brilliant idea, in her opinion, came to her mind, and it would take her from Skid Row to Easy Street if she could just find the right customer, to kick it off. Adele met a carpenter's wife, and she befriended her. After it seemed like they had built a solid friendship, Adele told the lady about a spectacular offer. It just so happened that Adele knew a guy. And that's how you know that the next thing you're going to hear is legit, when someone knows a guy. Anyway, she knew a guy who paid a return of 10% on investments. Now, it didn't occur to this carpenter's wife that Adele was also very poor and living in the same neighborhood as she, and that if Adele knew a guy who could do that, then maybe Adele herself would be in a better situation. But none of that matters. The lady believed Adele and gave her 100 gulden. Adele immediately gave the carpenter's wife her first payment of 20 gulden, which was 2 months of returns, then 110 gulden within 3 months. And with that, Adele's luck changed for the better, and everyone else's changed for the worse, because now the Spitzeder Bank was open for business. Today we would call it a Ponzi scheme, but in 1870, the namesake of the Ponzi scheme hadn't yet been born. Adele started advertising in the Munich newspapers. She was asking potential clients to invest 150 gulden with her. Her promise to them was 10% interest in 2 months. As Adele's scheme expanded, so did her reputation. Her so-called bank was now the talk of Munich, especially among the working-class communities who viewed her not just as a banker, but as their financial savior. People were so eager to hand over their life savings, and some even sold their farms, hoping to live off of the interest Adele promised. Just a few months later, she officially founded the Spitzeder Private Bank. But this wasn't your typical bank. Far from it. For starters, it didn't have a bank building. She was running it out of the hotel where she was renting a room, and no one thought that this was odd. To maintain the illusion of success, Adele cleverly divided her banking hours. Mornings were dedicated to payouts, often stretching until noon, as long lines of customers waited anxiously for their returns. Only after every withdrawal had been processed did Adele allow deposits to begin. The result? Even longer lines of people waiting for the privilege of giving her their hard-earned cash. She was good, and she knew what she was doing. Letting everyone see all of those customers walk out of her bank, better known as the hotel lobby, with smiles on their faces because their pockets were heavier after 2 months of a no-risk investment with Adele. The sheer number of customers flocking to her door only reinforced the image that Adele's business was thriving, because who wouldn't want to invest with the woman everyone else was lining up to see? But it wasn't just the promise of high returns that drew people in. Adele was putting on the performance of a lifetime. Sure, she may have been a flop on the stage, but in real life, she was a master actress. She sat on an elevated leather chair in the center of her bustling operation, dressed in a red nightgown and a cross around her neck, signing off investments like she was the most devout Christian woman in Bavaria. Her piety act was as carefully curated as her financial scam. Adele's frequent donations to the church and the soup kitchens she opened across Munich, 12 of them to be exact, only solidified her status as the angel of the poor. If Adele couldn't win over critics in the theater, she had certainly won over the masses with this performance. She was living up to her given name. She was the new Saint Adele. Despite her business booming, what was happening behind the scenes was a financial farce. Her employees were untrained. Money was stuffed into sacks and cupboards, and there was no system for accounting, unless you count jotting names with XXX by illiterate customers as a system. But none of that mattered to the investors, who were still receiving their payouts on time, and so they trusted her completely. Of course, giving her customers their returns helped Adele to establish trust, but so did this new holy image she was displaying. These were Christian people who blindly trusted Adele because they thought that their beliefs were hers too. They loved the idea of doing business with a Christian woman. Glory to God! Hallelujah! If only they had known that Adele was making a mockery of their faith just to get their money, they may have banked elsewhere, but who knows? those returns were just too good to turn down. And a lot of those people were anti-Semitic, and a lot of the other banks in the area were operated by Jewish bankers. At the height of her success, Adele was raking in up to 60,000 gulden a day and using it to live like royalty. To put it in perspective, that's like getting $1.2 million per day. She bought houses, artwork, and land across Bavaria, becoming the wealthiest woman in the region by 1871. But as her empire grew, so did the envy and suspicion of her competitors. Banks like the local and formerly popular Sparkassen Bank were hemorrhaging customers who preferred to invest with Adele, and the authorities were getting anxious. Public warnings were issued in the newspapers urging citizens not to trust the Spitzeder Bank, but by then, Adele was too entrenched. They could say whatever they wanted to say about her in their newspapers. She owned multiple local newspapers too, so she could control her image and how people perceived her. Just to prove to her customers that she wasn't afraid of the quote-unquote lies that were being spread about her in the news, she would boldly display news articles that called her a fraudster and a scammer. She placed them right where banking clients could see them when they were depositing money, clearly making the point that she had nothing to hide. The people loved it, and her cozy relationship with the church in those super Christian times ensured that public opinion remained in her favor. However, in the fall of 1872, the cracks began to show. The stage was being set for an international depression that I have discussed here before in a Titanic passenger scandal. It was the Panic of 1873. Now this was out of Adele's control. There was a real estate bubble burst in Europe and a stock market crash that preceded this economic downturn, and now Adele's customers were more interested in withdrawing funds than depositing them. And we know that without new deposits, this bank of hers couldn't go on existing. Her scheme was buckling under its own weight. Withdrawals started to outpace new investments, and for the first time, Adele felt the pinch. In a desperate attempt to hold off the inevitable, she cut withdrawal hours down to a single hour each morning, 6 to 7 a.m., and banned withdrawals on Wednesdays and Saturdays altogether. It was a far cry from the good old days when people were practically begging to give her their money and waiting in long lines for hours. Her act was finally wearing thin. The police, smelling blood in the water, persuaded a group of customers to file claims against her, leading the courts to order a review of her bank's books. And just like that, the curtain was about to close on Adele's greatest performance yet. Adele's lavish lifestyle and growing reputation as Munich's financial savior had drawn all sorts of attention, not just from the common folk, but also from those who were more skeptical of her business practices. Her bank, operating out of rented rooms, was under increasing scrutiny from newspapers and rival banks. But Adele wasn't just dealing with growing pressures from her fraudulent business. Her personal life was unraveling too. At this point, Adele was still in a romantic relationship with Brenzika. Their relationship, which had begun during their acting days, carried on into Adele's new banking venture, with Brenzika supporting her through it all. In fact, the local newspapers often referred to them as the two tricksters, openly calling out their lesbian relationship and accusing them of swindling innocent people. The press questioned the legitimacy of the Spitzeder Bank as early as 1870, noting that there were, quote, two fraudsters in the German house, directly pointing to Adele and Brenzika. The couple was living extravagantly, purchasing diamonds, expensive clothing, and enjoying a lavish lifestyle that mirrored the type of riches Adele promised to her investors. The same couldn't be said for her banking customers, and her personal life wasn't quite as solid. Behind the scenes, her relationship with Brenzika was beginning to fracture. Nobody knows exactly why it happened, but after one particularly heated argument, Brenzika stormed out leaving Adele for good. For Adele, who was used to getting what she wanted, this was a crushing blow. The two had been as close as any couple could be, but now, all that was over. And Adele, who had never been able to deal well with breakups, took this one pretty hard too. She was unable to cope, and she spiraled into depression. She locked herself away in her rooms, refusing to come out or engage with anyone. Her business was still operating, but hanging on a thread. And even with only a handful of customers coming around now, Adele was in no condition to run the operation. The situation was so dire that some of her customers, desperate to keep her afloat and reinvest their money, stepped in to care for her until she recovered. Some people truly believed that she could do no wrong. For Adele, it wasn't the loving care of her customers that could heal her. She was one of those people who has to be in a relationship. The only way that she was going to heal from Bransika walking out on her was with another woman. And that's exactly what she did. Now, if you remember from the beginning, I promised we'd get to a romance that would have you clutching your pearls, especially given the age gap. If a man had done what Adele did, we'd be calling him out in a heartbeat. Well, brace yourselves because here it is. The medicine to cure her love sickness for Bransika and her broken heart was a much younger woman. She needed a lady who could handle all of her craziness. So what did Adele do? The most logical thing, because that's how Adele operates. She takes out an ad in the local papers looking for a Gesellschafterin. Apparently, that's German for a lady's companion. But let's be clear, everyone in the know understood that this was a coded call for a romantic female partner. Adele had a lot of power and influence, but even she couldn't plainly publish an ad stating, "Yeah, I want me a tall brunette with big gazungas to come over here and really get," She could have been put in prison or worse for spelling it out. So, the women who liked women had to know the code, and they did. The same can't be said for the first applicant Adele picked. She was a French woman who, unfortunately, had no idea that she was signing up for more than just friendly chats over tea. I can hear her now. "Oh, mademoiselle, I thought you wanted those buns, not my buns." Anyway, the poor thing picked up her bags and left pretty quickly. Adele was left, once again, to her own devices, still searching for that perfect companion. Then, as luck would have it, a young woman named Rosa Ehinger moved in next door with her mother. Now, Rosa wasn't just young and apparently very good-looking to Adele. She was also an aspiring actress, just like Adele had once been. So, of course, Adele had to introduce herself and offer her, services, just to be polite. The two hit it off, and Adele started grooming Rosa for the stage. Now, at this time in her life, Adele was 40 years old. Rosa was a fresh-faced 21. In my book, this is inappropriate. Might not be illegal, but inappropriate. I've called out a number of similar age differences in other videos, stories in which the man is twice the age of the girl or young lady, and this is no different to me. Adele was out of line. Another thing that this relationship has in common with many of those stories is that the older person has a lot more money than the younger partner, and maybe, just maybe, the younger person would have had no interest in this much older person if the older person hadn't been loaded with cash. Adele didn't waste any time. She showered Rosa with lavish presents, as if she were auditioning for the role of the sweetest sugar mama in all of Europe. And it worked. Rosa quickly moved into Adele's home and even started working in her bank. Even if you don't like Adele, and there are plenty of reasons not to, you have to admire her efficiency. Why limit a girlfriend to being just a romantic partner when she can also double as an employee? Not only was Rosa working in the bank as a cashier, she was also working the corners for the bank. That sounds bad, I know, and while it may not be exactly what you're thinking, it's still bad enough. Business was really drying up by the time that Rosa came into Adele's life. She needed some deposits badly. All around her, young men were working their jobs as tradesmen and laborers, but they weren't bringing their money into the Spitzeder Bank for safekeeping. To resolve this issue, Adele gave Rosa her first acting job. She would have Rosa to get all dolled up and stand on corners, telling local men that they should give their money to her so that she could invest it for them. And it worked. But wait, Adele had been trying to get those same men to do business with her for months. So what was the difference now? Men paying attention to a pretty young lady? Apparently that worked better than whatever the older and reputedly less attractive Adele had been trying to do. Who'd have thunk it? Just kidding. Those guys thought that Adele was pretty too. Pretty ugly. Anyway, Adele had everything she wanted in Rosa. She was young and beautiful and helping her make money. She wasn't about to lose another woman like she had lost Brancica, so she treated Rosa to the high life, and the two were inseparable. For a time, it seemed like Adele had found the perfect replacement, but as we know, in Adele's world, good things never last. When the bank started to collapse, Rosa did what any sensible young woman might do in her position. She tried to make a run for it, with 50,000 gulden in her pocket. That's not exactly chump change, but the law caught up with both of them. Rosa claimed the money was a gift from her beloved Adele, but the police weren't buying it. Both women were arrested and the money was seized. Adele might have been the queen of deception, but it seems she met her match with Rosa, a young woman who was just as quick to turn her back when things got tough. I guess it's true what they say. There's no loyalty among thieves, even if they're girlfriends. The trial of Adele Spitzeder in July 1873 was nothing short of a spectacle. A public performance she couldn't quite control like her previous banking charade. For the first time in her life, Adele's name was able to draw a crowd, like she had wished for in all of her years of acting. She finally got top billing. She finally was able to pack a house. She finally was the star of the show, and once again, it was for being a bad actor, but in the other sense of the phrase, a person who was behaving badly. Well, they say to be careful what you wish for because you just might get it. Adele had always wanted to be famous, and now she was, for all the wrong reasons. The courtroom was packed, so packed that people had to be turned away, and the press bench was overflowing, hungry for every scandalous detail of the greatest financial fraud Germany had ever seen. As the trial began, one thing was clear. This wasn't just about fraudulent bankruptcy. It was a public reckoning. I was able to see copies of some of the court documents from this case and some of the newspaper articles that were written in Germany and even here in the United States, in Nebraska in particular. I did not know that there was such a huge German population in Nebraska. That's something that I learned while researching this story. And when I saw those documents, I was lost because I do not read German. But thankfully, a lot of this has been written about and translated into English, so this is what I learned about the trial and the sentencing. Adele was charged with failing to keep proper records, embezzling customers' funds, and, of course, wasting enormous amounts of money. But Adele, ever the actress, maintained throughout the trial that she had done nothing wrong. She still claimed that her business was entirely legal. After all, the law didn't have a proper definition of fraud that covered what she had done. She was taking new deposits to pay off old deposits, and that wasn't explicitly illegal at the time. And that technicality worked in her favor. She couldn't be convicted of outright fraud, but her creative accounting would ultimately take her down. What made this trial even more salacious was the parade of people who testified against her. Many of the witnesses were people who had once been close to Adele. There were disgruntled customers and former employees, all painting a picture of a lavish lifestyle entirely funded by money Adele swindled from her thousands of unsuspecting victims. One particularly cutting blow came from none other than Emily Steer, also known as Brandzika. The same Brandzika who had been her girlfriend, the same Brandzika who helped her run the bank, the same Brandzika who enjoyed the luxurious life of presence and indulgence until things went sour. Well, now she was ready to take the stand against her former lover, and likely with some personal satisfaction after their dramatic breakup. She wanted to tell it all. Yep, she was stealing. Get her for that. And she was a big old lesbian, too. Don't forget that. Did you get that part, stenographer? Big lesbian, big time. I just want to be sure that it gets on the record that she was one. Surely Brandzika thought that she walked away from the situation early enough for her name to not be attached to the bank. She thought that the stink of Adele's name wouldn't be able to touch her. Well, even if some people were willing to overlook her role in the bank's early days, most people weren't willing to overlook her romance with Adele, which was brought up during the trial. And it was the president of the trial who put an emphasis on their relationship. The president of the trial is basically a judge, and the one over Adele's case couldn't help but mention that Adele and Brandzika were two women who had shared a bed, breast to breast. I can only imagine the shock in the courtroom, and the shock going through Brandzika's system when her relationship with Adele was laid out before all of those people. She had no choice but to renounce Adele. But Brandzika wasn't the only one who turned against Adele. Her servants, her friends, and even her business associates all had their moment in the spotlight, recounting tales of Adele's extravagant lifestyle, her high salaries for unqualified workers, and her excessive spending on everything from diamonds to fancy parties, all things that they once enjoyed with Adele. But probably the most painful witness testimony for Adele to hear came from her young, beautiful Rosa. Rosa was just a user, not a fool. When she saw the public's reaction to Brandzika, she transformed from homosexual to heterosexual in mere seconds. She would go on to testify that the 50,000 gulden that we all know she stole from Adele was actually a payment from Adele. It was to compensate her for the reputational damage that she suffered because people thought that she was in a relationship with Adele. Yeah, right. My same-sex friends shower me with diamonds all the time. Of course you two were just friends. Womp, womp. But Rosa wasn't going to be able to lie her way out of her involvement with Adele, whether it came to the bedroom or the business. The most important testimony was about Adele and Rosa, because Rosa was on trial too. She was a co-defendant, and everyone knew that she was in on the scam, though she tried her best to make herself out to be a victim. Despite her protests of innocence, she was found guilty of aiding Adele. It didn't help Rosa's case that she had tried to flee with that 50,000 gulden, claiming it was a gift and then changing her story to say that Adele gave it to her for ruining her reputation by making people think that she was a lesbian. The court wasn't buying her story either, and neither were the jurors who sentenced her. Rosa was sentenced to 6 months in prison. Even after being presented with the damning financial evidence, a deficit far exceeding any recoverable assets, Adele stayed cool. The trial revealed the sheer scale of the fraud. 32,000 people defrauded of a staggering 38 million gulden, equivalent to roughly $526 million today. When the jury withdrew to deliberate, she sat there confidently. But as the minutes ticked by, the weight of her actions seemed to sink in. When it was time to announce the verdict, Adele sank sideways onto the judge's dais, covering her face with her hand, a dramatic gesture fitting of her theatrical past. Then the verdict was announced. Guilty. While Adele wasn't convicted of fraud itself, because astonishingly, Ponzi schemes weren't technically illegal yet, she was found guilty of failure to keep books, embezzlement of customers' funds, and excessive waste of money. Her banking practices may have collapsed, but her boldness never did. She maintained her innocence throughout the trial, refusing to admit any wrongdoing, insisting that her business was entirely legal. In the end, Adele was sentenced to 3 years and 10 months in prison. Rosa got her 6 months, and a few other accomplices received shorter sentences, including Adele's valet and cook, who had helped stash stolen money. But of course, Adele couldn't leave the trial without one last act of defiance. She told anyone who would listen that she had been misunderstood, that she had done nothing wrong, and that the entire trial was a farce. "This is all a big misunderstanding, you know. I haven't done anything wrong. You all are wrong. You'll see." And scene. It was as if she hadn't grown at all since her days on the stage, and couldn't accept criticism of her bad acting. Once again, everyone else was wrong and she was right. Sure, the trial was a farce in Adele's mind, but the reality was far more tragic for her thousands of customers who had lost everything. They would never get their money back, and many couldn't live with the consequences of her betrayal. A wave of suicides followed in the wake of the Spitzeder banking collapse. And look, we've seen these kinds of stories before, people ending their lives because they lost all of their money. It happened after the Asian financial crisis of 1997, and the big one here in the USA, the stock market crash of 1929. Well, again, the backdrop of Adele's scheme was the Panic of 1873. So while the timing of the self-inflicted deaths took place around the time that Adele's fraud was exposed, it's almost impossible to say which ones were 100% related to her crimes. But now it was time for Adele to pay for her wrongdoing, and she had some company on the way from the courthouse to her prison cell. The lovely Rosa. They would take one last trip together. It didn't quite live up to the splendor of the trips they had taken before when they were living off of ill-gotten gains, but at least they had, who am I kidding? There's no silver lining to this part. Those miserable broads got what they deserved. But, as we'll see next, even prison couldn't completely dim the flare of Adele Spitzeder, the woman who, until the very end, thought she was smarter than everyone else. Prison didn't have any of the amenities that had been a part of Adele's extravagant lifestyle. She hated it. If she could have given it a Google review, it would have been 1 star. The Gray Bar Hotel just didn't meet her standards. But because she was in poor health, she was granted more lenient treatment than the young and vibrant Rosa, who had to perform hard labor behind bars. Adele was confined in the prison on Baader Street in Munich, where she spent her days in relative comfort, indulging in artistic pursuits. And she finally did some real work. It took her being locked away in a prison cell, but she finally got a job and worked an honest living. And it was a job that she was really good at, translating Italian and English literature to German, and translating court evidence documents like letters and statements of offenders and fellow prisoners from Italian to German. So now, the woman who spent most of her life avoiding work was finally put to it in the most ironic twist, working in prison. But the work was easy, and it gave her time to write her memoirs, which she later published. While she was incarcerated, she got the news about the saddest thing that she would have to write in her story. Adele received word that her mother had died of a stroke that first December that she was locked away, and she was not allowed to attend the funeral. Her emotional isolation deepened, but that's what happens in prison. After her release in 1876, Adele emerged from prison frail and in poor health, suffering from hemiplegia, which causes paralysis or severe weakness on one side of the body. She was only 44 years old and unable to climb stairs on her own. Despite this, she returned to her old ways, living off of benefactors and even attempting to restart her financial schemes. She found a new companion, Marie Ridmeyer, and together they ran a small-scale money business. But in an almost comical twist of fate, when authorities arrested Adele again in 1880, they decided that anyone still willing to invest with her was too damn stupid to be protected by the state. Adele and Marie were released without charges, the government essentially declaring that her new victims deserved exactly what they got. Despite her tarnished reputation, Adele attempted to regain some fame by returning to the stage, but this time as a folk singer. She sang and played the pianino, a smaller, upright piano with a limited range, but her efforts were unsuccessful. Whether she was young or old, acting or singing, it appears that the public was just never interested in Adele performing on stage. In addition to being as bad at singing as she was at acting, people simply couldn't forget the colossal fraud she had pulled off. Her last years were marked by brief periods of scandal, arrests, and rejection by the public. But she never fully abandoned her fraudulent ways, resulting in a few more occasional trials and incarcerations. In 1895, after years of living off the dwindling generosity of others, Adele passed away from cardiac arrest at the age of 63. Adele's death was as unremarkable as her final years. Buried anonymously in a grave in Munich's old southern cemetery, her gravestone bears the name Schmid, a posthumous name change granted to her family. After decades of notoriety, even her name was wiped away. Adele's death certificate listed her occupation as writer. Do you think that's how she would have wanted to be remembered? Adele Spitzeder's life, a strange blend of ambition, deceit, and delusion, closed its last chapter in virtual anonymity. And perhaps that was the final punishment, to be forgotten. Just another name etched in stone, a name that wasn't even her own. But thankfully for Adele, we here at Hot Mess History will keep her name alive, because we live for a good scandal and a hot mess. There was another woman who existed near the same time frame as Adele Spitzeder, and she was also quite the fraudster. She started running her schemes right around the time that Adele was slowing down. Her name was Cassie Chadwick, but those who she defrauded knew her as Miss Carnegie, as in Andrew Carnegie, the richest man in the world at the time. Cassie stole millions of dollars by coming up with a scheme in which she pretended to be his secret love child. Her thievery caused a lot of heartache, and in case you watch The Gilded Age, the character Maud Beaton is fashioned after Cassie. I published a story about her, and you can see it here. I'll also leave links to it in the description box and in the pinned comment. And remember to check out the special offer from today's sponsor, Factor. The links are in the description box and the pinned comment as well. My sources for this story are Memphis Daily Appeal Archives, 1872. Chicago Tribune Archives, 1872. The Buffalo Commercial Archives, 1872. Harper's Weekly Archives, 1873. Der Neue Peterval Archives, 1873. San Francisco Chronicle Archives, 1895. Los Angeles Herald Archives, 1896. St. Louis Globe Democrat Archives, 1903. Adele Spitzeder by Dr. Marita A. Panzer. Royal Historical Society Camden 5th Series, Appenzell Calendar 1874, and Munich State Archives. This video has been brought to you by me. Well, my Patreon is a sponsor for this video. If you like these dirty scandals on my channel, then you'll love my Patreon, Ty's Too Hot Hot Mess History. It has all of the stuff that I can't talk about or show here because it's just too hot, too violent, too sexual, too graphic, too much. Come and join us there for the Hot Mess History. The link is in the description box.